Hey, good morning, Gasaholics. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got gas, the morning edition. This is day 3, 4, 2, something like that in Salt Lake City. We've come back from Bonneville. We're spending some time with some family in Salt Lake City. But gas continues. That's right, I get gas every day, and I'm giving it to you too. All right, today we are going to talk about the history of the steering wheel because cars weren't always controlled with the steering wheel. That's right. You don't believe me? Well, go back in time. The first cars that were produced, they weren't called cars, they were automobiles or horseless carriages or what have you, were steered by a tiller. Now, the tiller sat in the center of the vehicle, and the driver turned or angled the tiller depending on which way they wanted to go. You like that? See, I'm angling. Well, it wasn't until late 1800s, shortly after the automobile or the horseless carriage came out, that someone decided, you know what? I want to just turn the steering wheel. I can't keep moving my arm back and forth. Kept hitting the passengers. I don't know. She got slapped a couple of times, depending on how far he turned the tiller. I know I have, but that's another story altogether. Anyway, it was Alfred Verscharon, and he was driving a Panhard 4 horsepower high performance race car back then, and he put a steering wheel on the vehicle. Now, at first, cars were produced with steering wheels on either the right or the left hand side. Now, in some places, it stayed on the right. In some places, it went to the left. Lean to the right, lean to the left, stand up, sit down. That's another, completely different. Anyway, from 1898 on, Panhard kept the steering wheel on their cars. They didn't go back to the tiller. Others started following through by 1898. A lot of the cars just forgot about tillers and started moving up to the steering wheel. Thomas Jeffrey and his son Charles developed 2 advanced experimental cars featuring a front engine. You got to remember, back when cars first came out, it was simple to put the engine in the back of the vehicle, driving the rear wheels. Instead of having a drive shaft and a big transmission between the two, they opted for just mounting the engine in the back. It worked quite well. But in 1898, Thomas and his son Jeff put an advanced motor in the front. Now, we later know that most cars moved to that situation, front engine. So with that, the tiller no longer worked at all. You couldn't put one in there. The engine was in the way. It also moved the passengers back, the driver back, and the wheels forward. So the tiller was really kind of tough to use. The first cars that adopted the steering wheel as a standard were the Ramblers, 1903. By 1904, all Ramblers featured steering wheels. Within a decade, steering wheels had replaced everything. There were no longer tillers to steer the vehicles. Now, passenger car steering wheels from time to time have changed. Most of them, as we know, are round. But if you look at race cars, some of them are just butterfly. Dragsters, for example, have a butterfly where you just grab it from the side here. There have been deep dish steering wheels, and that was considered a safety device. Ford was one of the first ones to do that in 1956, and they actually called it a safety device back then. They had collapsible spokes. So this way, if you got into an accident, the steering wheel collapsed. It still came forward, especially in a front accident. One of the problems, good morning, One, how you doing there? One of our guys from Irwindale Drag Strip. The problem with the early cars and steering is a solid rod going from the steering wheel to the steering box. And if you got into a front-end collision of any consequence, the frame would deform, forcing the steering wheel back. And that was one of the problems, big problems, with the early Corvairs. People would become impaled by their steering wheel. Again, remember, no shoulder belts. Very few cars had seat belts. When you got into a front-end accident, unless you had really strong arms, you moved forward, but the steering wheel came back. And many people crushed their chests, their rib cages, and so forth. So Ford decided the easy way was with a collapsible steering wheel. Now, a lot of custom wheels like we're used to seeing will deform in that direction as well because they're not that rigid. And it's a good thing to an extent. I did see a friend or someone that had a car that was in an accident about a year ago. He had one of those custom steering wheels, and it did deform. However, he still had the solid rod going to the steering box on a hot rod, and he got into an accident, it totaled the car out, and it came back, and it did hit him in the chest, doing some damage. Now, steering wheels and collapsible columns, well, the first collapsible column came out in 1934. Wasn't widely accepted, though, and it wasn't successfully marketed, so it went away. In 1956, as I said, Ford had the first flexible steering wheel. By 1968, though, and this was really after the issues with the Corvair, the federal government mandated that all steering columns had to be collapsible. Now, they've met that standard in many different ways, but it's pretty much the standard today. So you all have collapsible steering columns on new vehicles. Now, if you've got a hot rod, like I do, you don't, unless you have changed to a late model vehicle steering column. So that's one thing to think about. If you're thinking about some of the safety devices or things that you can add to a hot rod, it's not just about power, it is also about safety. On my hot rod, I've got 3-point seat belts. I don't have a different steering column, but that's in the works, and I got to talk to Marlon Mitchell about that because I'm having some steering issues with my car, and as long as I've got to change the steering box, I might as well change the steering column as well. So that's something we're going to be looking into. And I'm not quite sure if the aftermarket steering columns are built with the collapsible feature, but a steering column from a late model car can be adapted, and many people do just that. That will give you not only the collapsible steering column, but it'll also give you a possibility of a tilt. So you can move the steering wheel as you need to get it out of your way, out of your line of sight, or in a more comfortable position. I like a straight-on position, although some people like them up in the air like this. Others like them, you can move them around with a tilt column. Now, Ford had a swing-away column on Thunderbirds, and that was supposedly to help you get in and out of the car easier. It worked. It was on T-Birds for a few years. They don't do that anymore, and I guess part of that could have been because of the collapsible steering column requirement. Putting those two options together didn't necessarily work. So the collapsible steering column and the swing-away steering column didn't work as a unit. So they fixed the steering column, and then they put in the collapsible setup. Now, as I said earlier, some countries maintain right-hand steer, others left-hand steer. The companies or the countries that model after the British pretty much keep the right-hand steering. Now, Europe had right and left-hand steering, depending on what country you were in. And then a few years back, many years back, they pretty much switched to left-hand steer, except for Great Britain, who maintained the right-hand steer. The confusion was tremendous. I've seen photos of Sweden where on the day they switched from right hand to left hand, it was just massive traffic jams. And can you imagine, you've got a right-hand steer car, and now you've got to be in the opposite lane. So you're no longer on the line side, you're now seated on the parking side. It's an interesting thing to get used to, and I've driven right-hand drive cars, and it's kind of cool, but man, passing is really difficult. So things to look at. Now, other designs, McLaren, for example, on their F1 sports car, or exotic car, had the steering in the center of the car. It had two seats adjacent to a driver's seat in the middle, and that was based after their Formula One cars. So steering wheels have been around for a long time. The banjo wheels with the wire centers, most cars have either 2 or 3 spokes, but Citroën, they had a single spoke steering wheel for quite some time. It's kind of cool looking. Chrysler worked on kind of rectangular steering wheels. They weren't quite rectangular, but they weren't round. A lot of race cars have a flat bottom on the steering to give you more room to get your legs underneath and keep the steering wheel low in the cockpit. I've seen cars with the grips on the side. Now, one of the things I learned from Doug Herbert in his driving school is no longer do we keep our hands at 10 and 3. If you keep your hands at 10 and 3 and you're involved in an accident, the first thing that's going to happen, besides the car getting all crushed, the airbag is going to hit your wrists and hit your arms. So Doug Herbert's driving school brakes suggests you now put your hands at 9 and 3. The reason for that, okay, Sam's helping me on this one. I'll get to that in just a second. But the reason for that is with your hands at 10 and 3, you're now out of the way of the airbag for the most part, and your arms won't get hit and flung apart. Now, Sam, our expert here, and I love all the information he gives us, Sweden was the only country on the continent, on the European continent, that was right-hand drive, and they changed that in 1967. That's why I remembered that. I didn't know if there were other countries that did it, but I've seen the pictures of all the chaos that happened on the day they changed over in Switzerland to left-hand drive. They were right-hand drive, but Britain's still there. Mark McGeorge, right-hand drives, though, are bad. Yeah, they're cool. Now, I have driven, working with the Isuzu division of General Motors, I got to drive a cab-over truck that was right-hand drive. And that was quite interesting to do because, well, you're up front, you've got perfect vision, but you're sitting on the opposite side of the vehicle when driving here in the States. And when I did that, the looks you get from people were just crazy. People would look up and they'd see a steering wheel in your hand. So it was fun. And airbag recommendations. Yeah, that's one thing you could feasibly re-engineer into your car. Now, the airbag is part of the steering wheel, which is part of the steering column. There's a DERM, what they call the unit that activates the airbag, normally mounted on the firewall of a car. A lot of people think there's a button or some sort of switch in the bumper. No. The airbag is activated based on deceleration. And in the early ones, and I don't know if it's still true, but when I was still working in the auto industry, there was a gold-plated, I guess, ball bearing or marble. It was held in place by a magnet. The force necessary to release that gold-plated ball from the magnet would be sufficient to activate the airbag, and it would move forward, making contact and igniting the airbag. Raise your hands. How many actually think there's air in an airbag? I've had stories of that. And personal. When I ran the consumer relations division for an auto manufacturer, airbags became required. People were not sure how they would work. They had seen the movie Dumb and Dumber, and the bags opened up full of air and stayed inflated like a big balloon. No, they don't. They're open and closed in a 20th of a second, I believe. You will not see an airbag. If you do see an airbag, it's only momentarily as you're blinded by the powder on it and so forth, or in the case of Honda, blinded by the pieces that come out, the shards. But the airbag does not contain air. It is a controlled explosion coming out of the steering column or the dashboard for the passenger side of the vehicle, or on the side of the vehicle. Those are bags, but they are not full of air. They're only there momentarily, full of combusted gases and force to cushion your head, your shoulder, whatever, where you got them. There are some airbags that come out of the pillars on the car, the side pillars, the front pillars. They're air curtains they have, and those are really cool. And it keeps your head from hitting the glass at a hard rate on the side of the vehicle or the side pillar on a sedan. They started with airbags. Airbags came out initially in the early or the late 1970s, early 1980s. And at first, they came out with such force they would cause injury in some cases, especially if you were not seat belted or you were of small stature. That has changed. They've changed all that. They've changed the force of which they come out, and mandatory. You've got to be wearing your seatbelt. Most states, I don't know of any state right now that doesn't require that you wear a seatbelt. Mark McGeorge is saying, a weight in a box usually in the center console. Well, sometimes they're in the center console. In the case of one of the companies I worked for, and Generous Motors was one of those, the box was actually either under the dash or in the firewall area of the vehicle. And again, they're not measuring deformation of the vehicle. They're measuring deceleration. And I've had people, I had someone contact me once saying she had a used airbag in her car. Because when it opened, she didn't remember being hit by the airbag, but whoever had it before her used the same color lipstick she had. Yep. Okay, and you can think about that. Sam says the first airbag was 1973 in General Motors cars. Probably was. I was on the commercial side. We didn't get those, and I don't think that some of the commercial vehicles at the higher gross vehicle weight ratings still do not have airbags. They do have seat belts, though. All right, so seat belts, airbags, steering wheels, great devices. Custom steering wheels, a very big business early on, but not so much now, because the controls on a car are on the steering wheel in a lot of cases. The first one to put the controls in the center of the steering wheel, well, besides the directional signal,